Over the course of just one generation, the entire world map was radically redrawn. We're going to dive into the story of decolonization, how centuries-old empires completely fell apart and dozens of new nations were born, shaping the world we know today.
You know, if you were to look at a world map from 1945, you'd see these huge areas of Africa and Asia colored in, showing they were controlled by European powers. But fast forward just 30 years, to 1975, and boom, those colors are gone. They've been replaced by tons of new countries. So how on earth did such a massive change happen so quickly?
The answer in one word is decolonization. And this wasn't just about swapping out flags or changing names on a map. No, this was a deep, fundamental reshaping of global power, of national identity, and really the entire structure of our modern world.
All right, let's get into the first big chapter of this story, the end of empire. This was nothing short of a revolution in the 20th century, and it signaled the collapse of hundreds of years of European dominance.
So this didn't just happen out of nowhere. The whole thing was really set in motion by two powerful forces that came together at just the right time. A revolutionary new idea and, well, the old empires just being completely worn out.
And you know, the spark for all this came from a kind of surprising place. After World War I, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson started talking about this idea of self-determination. Now, he probably just meant it for countries in Europe, but that idea, it spread like wildfire. People in colonies who had just fought and died for these empires started asking a pretty simple question. Hey, why doesn't that apply to us?
But the real game changer, the thing that kicked everything into high gear, was World War II. The European empires went into that war as these mighty global powers. They came out of it technically as victors, but they were also broke and just exhausted. All of a sudden, they didn't have the money or the energy to hang on to these huge overseas territories, especially with powerful independence movements pushing back.
But here's the thing. Gaining independence wasn't a one-size-fits-all process. As these empires started to weaken, the colonies had to figure out how to get their freedom, and they generally went down two very different roads: negotiation or war.
On one hand, you had the path of political pressure and nonviolent civil disobedience, which we famously saw in India. And on the other hand, you had armed conflict, which led to some really brutal, long-drawn-out wars like the one in Algeria. And the path that was chosen often made all the difference between a peaceful handover of power and a bloody, hard-won victory.
Let's talk about India's model. The struggle there, led by incredible figures like Mohandas Gandhi, was a total landmark. Through years and years of nonviolent resistance, the Indian National Congress basically made it impossible for Britain to govern. When India got its independence in 1947, it sent this huge message to the rest of the world. You can become sovereign without firing a single shot.
Now, Algeria, a totally different story. France just refused to let go. And why? Well, a big reason was the huge number of European settlers living there. This refusal kicked off a vicious, long war for independence, led by the National Liberation Front, also known as the FLN.
1 million. Let that sink in. That's about how many French settlers, they were known as pieds noirs, lived in Algeria. For the French governments in Paris, Algeria wasn't just some colony. They saw it as a part of France itself, and because of that, they were willing to fight tooth and nail to keep it.
The result was an absolutely devastating 8-year war. It cost hundreds of thousands of lives and was so intense it nearly caused a civil war back in France. In the end, it forced France to grant independence in 1962. The war in Algeria was proof that even the most stubborn empire could be broken by a relentless fight for freedom.
Okay, so winning independence was a massive achievement, but it was really only the first hurdle. These brand new nations were born into a world that was already splitting into two hostile camps. The Cold War, this big standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, was about to make everything way more complicated. So this was the million-dollar question for every single new nation. You've broken the chains of the old empire. Great. But now you're stuck in the middle of a global tug-of-war between two new superpowers, and both of them are demanding you pick a side.
Indonesia is a perfect case study here. Its first leader, Sukarno, initially cozied up to the Soviet Union and China. But then, after a really violent coup in 1965, the new military government did a complete 180 and shifted its allegiance to the West. This kind of political whiplash, well, it became a common and often dangerous experience for a lot of new countries.
But a lot of these nations looked at this choice and said, no way, we're not doing this.
Instead, many of them banded together to create a third option, the non-aligned movement. Their message was pretty simple, but it was also defiant. We refuse to be pawns in your Cold War. We're going to protect our new freedom and do our own thing.
So, when we zoom out, what's the lasting legacy of this whole era? Well, these forces, nationalism, war, geopolitics, they didn't just draw new lines on a map. They actually created a completely new global order.
When you boil it all down, you can really see the four key things that had to happen. You had the powerful internal push of nationalism. You had the big idea of self-determination, giving it all a moral right. Then you had the economic exhaustion of the old empires, which made them weak. And finally, you had the new pressure of Cold War geopolitics. It was really the collision of these four things that redrew the map of our world.
And all of this leaves us with one final, really complicated question. Decolonization created over 100 new countries and gave billions of people the right to rule themselves. But if you look around today, so many of our current conflicts and problems have their roots right back in this chaotic period. So you have to ask yourself, did the end of empire actually create a more stable world?